Hi everyone, my name is Ross Comfort. I'm a deputy head down in Kent, but I've been an English teacher for just over 10 years now, focusing on GCSE and A-level predominantly. And today I'm going to talk you through one of the poems that appear in the OCR Anthology under the conflict section. I've already done a few of these, so you might have seen some of these previously. But today we're going to have a look at a poem called Vergissmeinnicht, which we'll have a look at in terms of what that means and what it stands for and things as we go through today's lesson. So I'm just going to try and share my screen with you. And you should see, hopefully, a presentation now. There we are. So Vergissmeinnicht by a chap called Keith Douglas. Now, with all poems, regardless of exam board, actually, what you need to be able to do in terms of your GCSE is you need to be able to analyse the context, only briefly with OCR, a small amount, and the main marks are for your analysis of language, form and structure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the poem today and we're going to talk about each of those areas and try and break them down, and then I'll try and give you some examples of ways in which you can analyse each of those sections in the poem itself. So in terms of the context, Douglas, he actually died in 1944, so we're talking Second World War, and he was actually killed in the invasion of Normandy. Now, of course, this is important because he himself, having experienced war, means that he's a sort of valid source of information about what war is truly like and what that conflict was truly like. So you can make reference to that. And I've spoken about Anthem for Doomed Youth, which appears on this anthology as well, written by Wilfred Owen, another famous war poet called Siegfried Sassoon. He doesn't appear in this anthology, but he might in some other exam boards. But can you see any other links between those poets? And I've alluded to one of the main links previously, is that they've experienced war themselves. They're able to convey the reality of conflict to us because they've experienced it firsthand. And why did he write poetry showing the reality of war? Well, similar to Owen and Sassoon and all of the famous war poets, what Douglas was trying to show was actually the harsh reality that war brings. So you tended to have the propaganda machines working at home to say how great war was, how noble it was, how much honour you would receive if you went and fought for your country, and actually glorified the conflict, glorified the war. But what he and the other war poets were doing, he being Douglas, sorry, and all the war poets were doing, were actually trying to show the reality of what war was really like. And it might be the horrific conditions of the battlefield, the death, the sort of the senses that you would be bombarded with, the sights and smells of death, anything like that. Or actually, as we'll see in Douglas's case, this idea that you become really desensitized to something quite horrific due to the conflict, due to war. So let's dive into the poem itself, and what I'll do is I'll try and break this up as much as I can into sort of language, form and structure for you, and you'll see on the screen there I've just sort of annotated as much as I can really. This isn't a finite list, but there's plenty to get your teeth stuck into. So what I'll do is I'll sort of go through stanza by stanza and talk you through some of my notes there. So he begins here: 3 weeks gone and the combatants gone, returning over the nightmare ground, we found the place again and found the soldier sprawling in the sun. This sibilance, the repetition of an S, hushing sound, it's almost soothing in this case. The soldier sprawling in the sun gives us this image of almost a soldier relaxing, like he's on the beach on holiday. But as we'll soon see, that is far from the reality. We have the adjective there in the second line describing the ground as nightmarish. We'll talk about the repetition when we think about the structure. But even picking out particular adjectives to highlight whatever effect it is you're trying to make is a good tip when analysing any poem, in fact. But in this particular case, the nightmare ground, it's in stark contrast, a real juxtaposition when you have two contrasting images. Nightmare ground contrasting with this soldier sprawling in the sun. We think, well, it doesn't sound that nightmarish when you've got this hushed, almost sea breeze-esque sibilance coming through and the soldier sprawling in the sun. The frowning barrel of his gun overshadowing. As we came on that day, he hit my tank with one like the entry of a demon. Now it starts to become darker. The personification of the barrel of the gun, personification when you give qualities to an object, human qualities. This barrel of the gun, the gun itself is frowning, the gun itself is unhappy, and the gun itself is overshadowing, highlighted by the caesura, which we'll talk about in the structure, but that pause in the middle of the line, what is overshadowing everything? It's the gun, the symbol of conflict, the symbol of death, the symbol of war. As we came on that day, he hit my tank with one like the entry of a demon, really powerful simile there, literally with this hellish comparison to a demon. So this soldier who's sprawling in the sun is actually the enemy. He's shot at our persona talking in this poem. Could even be Douglas, who knows? But this persona's talking, and he says the soldier sprawling in the sun was the one who hit him with a shot from a gun and hit his tank. Look, here in the gun pit spoil, the dishonoured picture of his girl who has put Steffi Vergissmeinnicht in a copybook Gothic script. Juxtaposition there we've just touched upon, but we now have this really powerful emotional contrast. Steffi, seemingly the girlfriend of this now dead soldier, has written Vergissmeinnicht, which actually is German for forget-me-not. It's also a type of flower, interestingly. But in copybook Gothic script is a very neat, very controlled font, if you like. You might have seen it on the computer before. But actually, the juxtaposition here is this horrific image we're about to see in this, with this dishonoured picture of the girl versus the neatness of this handwriting. It just goes to show that war touches every part of our lives. So in this case, it's destroyed this relationship that was once prim and proper and perfect, like the copybook Gothic script, but is now dishonoured, as it describes in the second line of that verse, that third verse. We see him almost with content, abased and seeming to have paid and mocked at by his own equipment that's hard and good when he's decayed. More personification where his equipment, the guns, the grenades, the things that are strapped to him, his own equipment is mocking him in death. And the only thing that remains, even when the bodies are decayed, is just that, the equipment, the guns, the things that are the symbols of war. It's Douglas suggesting that even when there is death, that's all going to go. And the thing that's going to remain is war and death and guns and those symbols. But she would weep to see today how on his skin the swart flies move, the dust upon the paper eye, and the burst stomach like a cave. Another simile to end this stanza here, where the stomach is compared to a cave, this cavernous being where his stomach once was. And the real graphic language of the paper eye, this dead, lifeless eye of the human being, with the swart flies moving around this now lifeless eye and this cavernous area where his stomach used to be. For here the lover and the killer are mingled, who had one body and one heart, and death, who had the soldier singled, has done the lover mortal hurt. So we end with a very powerful metaphor, the one body and one heart, this life of this soldier mingles together. And it's sort of similar to what I said previously, where this whole conflict, this war has destroyed the life and the soul of the heart of this person, but not only the heart of him, of course, but the heart of his girlfriend, Steffi, who has, of course, lost her lover. In terms of the form, in this case, we're looking at stanzas in quatrains, meaning 4 lines. It's like a quattro 4. There's an awful lot of para-rhyme, really similar to Wilfred Owen. Para-rhyme is sort of like a half rhyme. Gone and sun, you have the repetition, that consonant n sound, so it's not a perfect rhyme, gone and sun. But there's that para rhyme. Ground and found, of course, there is a rhyme, and you see this through the poem. And the reason that the war poets, including Douglas, uses para rhyme is to say that this conflict of war, it disrupts everything, even the structure, the rhyme of the poems themselves. Okay, there's a very somber and a very matter-of-fact tone, even though there's some quite graphic imagery. There's a real lack of emotion through this poem. And it's actually, as I touched upon earlier again, it's actually Douglas suggesting that these soldiers have become desensitized to the real graphic, awful nature of war and conflict. due to the very nature of what it was like. And he's trying to show the people at home the reality of what that war was really like by saying, look how desensitized we have become to these horrific things simply because we're objected to seeing these things over and over and over again. And we've arranged in iambic pentameter, again, like a lot of the poems you would have seen in your Shakespeare studies, you'd have seen iambic pentameter. So that's the rhythm. You sort of didum, 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 didum rhythm. And when you're analysing iambic pentameter, the key to look out there is think about the words or the syllables that are stressed and think to yourself, well, why is it that those words, particular words, are stressed? So let's pick an example. The second stanza there, the frowning barrel of his gun. We can see that the last word gun is highlighted by the iambic pentameter, the rhythm. And therefore you can then expand on that and say, well, why is it highlighted? And it's highlighted in this case because it's the symbol of war. It's overshadowing as it goes on into the next line, but it's further emphasized by the rhythm, the iambic pentameter. In terms of the general structure, we said about the repetition in the first stanza, the ground we found, the place again and found. Douglas is suggesting that very much like he does later on, the war will continue, war repeats, war goes on, just like the guns remain even after the bodies are decayed, war goes on and carries on and on and on again. We've touched on the idea of caesuras, the overshadowing. So caesura is just a pause in the middle of that line there. So the pause after overshadowing, highlighting the power of the symbol of the gun. And in the third stanza there, look. Here in the gun pit spoil, it's almost Douglas telling us to, as a reader, sort of look, pause here, think about what you're actually looking at, because we need to realise the horrific nature of what war is really like. Look at this gun pit spoil, the spoil being sort of the reward of the gun pits, the pit that the artillery would have made with this soldier sprawled across it with his guts splayed everywhere like a cave and his dead eyes. And next to it, this dishonoured picture of his girlfriend that she's written a note to him saying, "Forget me not." It's a really emotional and hard image to get our heads around. But this is the whole point of the poem. This is why Douglas writes this, to show how awful these things are. And we've also got some examples of end-stop lines. So it's the opposite of enjambment. Enjambment is when the lines run into each other. So, for example, the first couple of lines there, 3 weeks gone and the combatant's gone, returning. There's no punctuation at the end, so they run on to the next. If there's punctuation at the end, you'd call it an end-stopped line. So the ones at the end here, for here the lover and the killers are mingled, who had one body and one heart. And what that does, very similar to the caesura, is it highlights the content previous to the end stop line. So in this case, it's highlighting that metaphor that we spoke about. In this case, that this soldier has once been a body and a heart. The soul, the body, has now been destroyed, as has the destruction of his own loved ones as well. Steffi in this case, but then by extension, also his any other family that he might have had. Now, again, generally speaking, for all poetry, you need to explain the effect of any chosen quotation, the effect on the reader. That's what I've been trying to do all the way through here. Picking out the devices is sort of only the first job, really. You've then got to explain the effect that those devices have on the reader, and then why. Why would Douglas want to convey that? And I've sort of a little tip here is be really smart with the quotation analysis. So when you're picking quotations, particularly in your exam, when it's a very pressurized time situation, pick quotations where you're able to analyze the language, form and structure from a single quotation. So we looked at an example earlier of the gun with iambic pentameter. Well, we can look at that in terms of structure and form, the iambic pentameter highlighting the symbol of the gun. If we perhaps took that whole line and then the overshadowing afterwards, we could also talk about the caesura, which we've touched upon, emphasizing the symbolism, so the language of the gun, and even the frowning barrel of the gun, personification. So even in those two lines, the frowning barrel of the gun overshadowing, we could talk about the effect of the personification, the iambic pentameter, and the caesura. So you're covering language, form and structure from one single quotation. And that's really smart analysis and really smart exam technique, because you're able to cram an awful lot of analysis in a very short space of time. And I thought what I'd do is just leave you with a bit of a practice question, which you could go away and have a look at in terms of this poem here. Explore how the poet conveys the reality of war. We've touched on this again all the way through when we're thinking about what Douglas is trying to show about the reality of war. And I've given you a suggestion as to how you could structure your essays. So I'd always suggest to my students, introduce the poem with a little brief context. So essentially summarize what the poem is about. Okay, so Vergissmeinnicht is XYZ, and a little bit of context about the poet, and then dive straight into your language form and structure analysis. So I talk about P paragraphs, point, evidence, explain. You might have looked at different versions of that, but essentially making a point that answers the question, in this case, i.e., what's the poet showing about the reality of war? So it might be that we are desensitized due to the constant violence of war. That might be your point. You then pick a quote that supports your point. So I'll point there, the desensitization that the soldiers have experienced. And then you analyze that quotation, depending what it is, talking about the language form and structure. And if you've been smart about your quotation selection, you'll be able to do each of those things for that particular quotation. Okay, and actually, if you're feeling really brave, what you are able to do in that last portion when you're analysing is actually make links to elsewhere. So, for example, if you were talking about the personification of the frowning barrel of the gun in the second stanza, you could potentially link that to the personification down in the last stanza, the personification of death that has done the lover mortal hurt. It's death is the one who's hurt him. So you could, and then obviously you need a second quotation there, but you can expand on those paragraphs by making the links like that, as long as you're still staying true to the single point you've made in that topic sentence, that first sentence of your paragraph. That's absolutely fine. Okay, super. So I hope that has helped with your Vergissmeinnicht understanding. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Good luck with everything, and I'm going to be recording some other videos on the other conflict poems, so hopefully you'll have a look at those and they'll be useful as well. Thank you again for watching.